26, line 10. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
By the direction of the Republican Conference, I offer a privilege resolution and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 6, resolved that the following named members be and are hereby elected to the following standing committees of the House of Representatives. 1.
Considered as read and printed in the record.
Without objection, the resolution is agreed to, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts rise?
Speaker, by direction of the Democratic Caucus, I offer a privilege resolution and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 7, resolved that the following...
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the resolution be considered as read and printed in the record.
Without objection, the resolution is agreed to, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
You ready? Oh, sorry.
Purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts rise?
Madam Speaker, I offer a resolution asking unanimous consent for its immediate consideration.
Clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 8, resolved that pursuant to the Legislative Pay Act of 1929 as amended, the 6 minority employees
Madam Speaker, I ask
authorized...
unanimous consent that the resolution be considered read and printed in the record.
Without objection. Without objection, the resolution is agreed to, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Madam Speaker, let me first say it's great to see you presiding over this great deliberative body, and I'd like to offer a privilege resolution and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 10, resolved that unless otherwise ordered before Tuesday, February 1st, 2011, the hour of daily meeting of the House shall be 2 p.m. on Mondays, noon on Tuesdays, 10 a.m. on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and 9 a.m. on all other days of the week, and from Tuesday, February 1st, 2011, until the end of the first session, the hour of daily meeting of the House shall be 2 p.m. on Mondays, noon on Tuesdays, or 2 p.m. if no legislative business was conducted on the preceding Monday, noon on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and 9 a.m. on all other days of the week.
Without objection, the resolution is agreed to, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The chair will receive a message.
Madam Speaker, a message from the Senate. Madam Speaker, I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has agreed to ESCOM Res 1, providing for a conditional recess or adjournment of the Senate and adjournment of the House of Representatives, in which the concurrence of the House is requested.
This is the gentleman from California rise?
Madam Speaker, I offer a privileged concurrent resolution and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the concurrent resolution.
House Concurrent Resolution 1, resolved that pursuant to Clause 4, Section 5, Article 1 of the Constitution, during the 112th Congress, the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader of the Senate, or their respective designees, acting jointly after consultation with the Minority Leader of the House and the Minority Leader of the Senate, may notify the members of the House and the Senate, respectively, to assemble at a place outside the District of Columbia if, in their opinion, the public interest shall warrant it.
Without objection, the concurrent resolution is agreed to, and the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that during the 112th Congress, the Speaker, Majority Leader, and Minority Leader be authorized to accept resignations and to make appointments authorized by law or by the House.
Without objection. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that during the 112th Congress, all members be permitted to extend their remarks and to include extraneous material within the permitted limit in that section of the record entitled Extensions of Remarks.
Without objection. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that during the first session of the 112th Congress, on legislative days of Monday or Tuesday, when the House convenes pursuant to House Resolution 10, the House shall convene 2 hours earlier than the time otherwise established by the resolution for the purpose of conducting morning hour debate. On legislative days of Wednesday or Thursday, beginning on February 1, 2011, when the House convenes pursuant to House Resolution 10, the House shall convene 2 hours earlier than the time otherwise established by the resolution for the purpose of conducting morning hour debate. When the House convenes pursuant to an order other than H.Res. 10, the House shall convene for the purpose of conducting morning hour debate only as prescribed by such order. That the time for morning hour debate shall be allocated equally between the parties and may not continue beyond 10 minutes before the hour appointed for the resumption of the session of the House, and the form of proceeding for morning hour debate shall be as follows: the prayer by the chaplain, the approval of the journal, and the pledge of allegiance to the flag shall be postponed until resumption of the session of the House. Initial and subsequent recognitions for debate shall alternate between the parties. Recognition shall be conferred by the Speaker only pursuant to lists submitted by the Majority Leader and by the Minority Leader. No member may address the House for longer than 5 minutes except the Majority Leader, the Minority Leader, or the Minority Whip. No legislative business shall be in order except the filing of privileged reports, and following morning hour debate, the Chair shall declare a recess pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1 until the time appointed for the resumption of the session of the House.
Without objection, so ordered. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Your committee appointed on the part of the House to join a like committee on the part of the Senate to notify the President of the United States that a quorum of each House has been assembled and is ready to receive any communication that he may be pleased to make has performed that duty.
Without objection, so ordered. Under Clause 5D of Rule 20, the Chair announces to the House that the whole number of the House is 434. The Chair customarily takes this occasion at the outset of a Congress to announce his or her policies with respect to particular aspects of the legislative process. The Chair will insert in the record announcements concerning, first, privileges of the floor, second, introduction of bills and resolutions, third, unanimous consent requests for the consideration of legislation, fourth, recognition for 1-minute speeches, fifth, recognition for special orders speeches, sixth, decorum in debate, seventh, conduct of votes by electronic device, eighth, use of handouts on the House floor, ninth, use of electronic equipment on the House floor, and 10th, use of the chamber. These announcements, where appropriate, will reiterate the origins of the stated policies. The Chair intends to continue in the 112th Congress the policies reflected in these statements. The policy announced in the 102nd Congress with respect to jurisdictional concepts related to Clause 5A of Rule 21, tax and tariff measures, will continue to govern but need not be reiterated, as it is adequately documented as precedent in the House Rules and Manual. Without objection, the announcements will be printed in the record. Pursuant to 2 U.S.C. 2001 and the order of the House of today, the Chair announces the Speaker's appointment of the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Cantor, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Pelosi, as members of the House Office Building Commission to serve with himself. The Chair lays before the House a message from the President of the United States.
To the Congress of the United States, pursuant to Title II United States Code, Section 2AA, I transmit herewith the statement showing the apportionment population for each state as of April 1st, 2010, and the number of representatives to which each state would be entitled. Signed, Barack Obama, the White House.
Referred to the Committee on the Judiciary and Oversight and Government Reform and ordered printed. The Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Honorable Karen L. Haas, Clerk of the House of Representatives. Madam, pursuant to House Concurrent Resolution 1, and also for purposes of such concurrent resolutions of the current Congress as may contemplate my designation of members to act in similar circumstances, I hereby designate Representative Eric Cantor of Virginia to act jointly with the Majority Leader of the Senate or his designee in the event of my death or inability to notify the members of the House and the Senate, respectively, or any reassembly under any such concurrent resolution. In the event of the death or inability of that designee, the alternate members of the House listed in the letter bearing this date that I have placed with the clerk are designated in turn for the same purposes. Signed sincerely, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House.
The Chair announces that the Speaker has delivered to the Clerk a letter dated January 5, 2011, listing members in the order in which each shall act as Speaker pro tem under Clause 8B3 of Rule 1. The Chair lays before the House a privileged concurrent resolution.
Senate Concurrent Resolution 1, resolved that A, when the Senate adjourns or recesses on any day from Wednesday, January 5th, 2011 through Monday, January 10th, 2011, on a motion offered pursuant to this concurrent resolution by its majority leader or his designee, it stand adjourned or recessed until 10 a.m. on Tuesday, January 25th, 2011, or until the time of any reassembly pursuant to Section 2 of this concurrent resolution, whichever occurs first. And B, when the House adjourns on the legislative day of Wednesday, January 12th, 2011, on a motion offered pursuant to this concurrent resolution by its majority leader or his designee, it stand adjourned until 2 p.m. on Tuesday, January 18th, 2011, or until the time of any reassembly pursuant to Section 3 of this concurrent resolution, whichever occurs first, and when the House adjourns on any legislative day from Wednesday, January 26, 2011, through Friday, January 28, 2011, on a motion offered pursuant to this concurrent resolution by its majority leader or designee, it stand adjourned until 2 p.m. on Tuesday, February 8, 2011, or until the time of any reassembly pursuant to Section 3 of this concurrent resolution, whichever occurs first. Section 2A, the majority leader of the Senate or his designee, after consultation with the minority leader of the Senate or his designee, shall notify the members of the Senate to reassemble at such place and time as he may designate if, in his opinion, the public interest shall warrant it. B, after reassembling pursuant to subsection A, when the Senate recesses or adjourns on a motion offered pursuant to this subsection by its majority leader or his designee, the Senate shall again stand recessed or adjourned pursuant to the first section of this concurrent resolution. Section 3, the Speaker or his designee, after consultation with the minority leader of the House, shall notify members of the House to reassemble at such place and time as he may designate if, in his opinion, the public interest shall warrant it.
Without objection, the concurrent resolution is agreed to and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The Chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leave of absence requested for Mr. DeFazio of Oregon for today.
Without objection, so ordered. For what purpose does the gentlelady from North Carolina rise?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move that the House do now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
So that wraps up the first day of the 112th Congress.